At first light on August 16, 1780, an American militiaman stood in a pine forest outside Camden, South Carolina, gripping a musket that felt far heavier than it had during training. Ahead of him, the morning mist hid the British line. He had never fought in a major battle. He had never seen professional infantry advance with fixed bayonets. Somewhere beyond the trees, veterans of Britain's 23rd and 33rd Regiments were quietly dressing their ranks, waiting for the order to move. Within the next 15 minutes, this young Virginian would throw down his weapon and run. Thousands of others would follow. An entire American army would collapse so completely that its commanding general would gallop nearly 60 miles before finally stopping his horse. The strange part is that the battle was not lost because the British were stronger. It was lost because one decision, made hours before the first volley, placed the wrong soldiers in the wrong place. Once that mistake met Britain's deadliest weapon, everything else unfolded almost exactly as military logic demanded. To understand why Camden became one of the greatest disasters of the American Revolution, we have to begin months before sunrise on that battlefield. By the summer of 1780, the war had entered its darkest phase for the American cause. The British had changed their strategy. Instead of grinding through another endless campaign around New York, London decided to crush the rebellion from the south. British commanders believed Georgia and the Carolinas contained thousands of loyalists waiting for protection. If the Crown secured the southern colonies, those loyalists could rebuild royal authority county by county before marching north to isolate Virginia and eventually surround Washington's remaining army. For a while, the plan worked almost perfectly. In December 1778, Savannah had fallen. Then, in the spring of 1780, General Sir Henry Clinton arrived outside Charleston with nearly 14,000 soldiers and one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. The city was surrounded by land and sea. American escape routes disappeared one after another. On May 12th, Major General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered roughly 5,000 Continental soldiers. It was the largest American surrender of the entire Revolutionary War. Charleston was not simply another city. It was the principal port of the South, a vital supply hub, and the backbone of American operations below Virginia. Once it fell, British forces suddenly controlled the coastline, major rivers, and the logistical network that connected the southern colonies. For many observers, the revolution already looked finished. The Continental Congress desperately needed someone who could reverse the catastrophe. Their choice seemed obvious: Horatio Gates. Only 3 years earlier, Gates had become the hero of Saratoga. His army had accepted the surrender of General John Burgoyne, a victory so important that it persuaded France to openly join the war against Britain. Across America, Gates was celebrated as the general who had humbled the British Empire. Newspapers praised him, politicians trusted him, many even whispered that he, not George Washington, had been the Revolution's finest commander. Now Congress handed him another impossible mission. Travel south. Gather whatever troops remained. Stop Lord Cornwallis before the Carolinas were completely lost. When Gates reached North Carolina in late July, reality looked nothing like the reports he had received. He did not inherit an army. He inherited fragments. Thousands of experienced Continentals had been captured at Charleston. Others were dead, wounded, or scattered across the countryside. Supplies barely existed, food was scarce, horses were dying. Entire units lacked proper ammunition, tents, or shoes. Most alarming of all, the majority of Gates's new soldiers were not Continental regulars. They were militia. Many had answered the call only days earlier. Some had never fired their muskets outside local musters. Few had trained to maneuver in formation under fire. Even fewer possessed bayonets. Unlike Britain's professional infantry, whose tactics revolved around disciplined movement and aggressive shock action, these men had learned to rely almost entirely on musket fire. That difference would become the central mechanism of the battle. Across the line stood an army built for exactly the opposite kind of fighting. Lord Charles Cornwallis had not become Britain's most dangerous commander in America by accident. His regular regiments had survived years of campaigning against Washington's army. Officers knew how long to hold fire, when to advance, and exactly how to exploit hesitation. Among them were veterans of the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the 33rd Regiment of Foot, units that had spent years perfecting one of the most terrifying battlefield maneuvers of the 18th century. Not musket volleys. Bayonet charges. Before a single shot had been fired outside Camden, two very different armies were already marching toward each other. One trusted discipline forged over years of war. The other trusted courage that had never yet been tested. Neither commander knew it yet, but before the sun reached its highest point, one deployment decision would force those two worlds to collide in exactly the worst place imaginable. The men gathering outside Camden looked like they belonged to the same army. They carried similar muskets, wore hunting shirts or faded military coats, and marched beneath the same American banners. But beneath that appearance was a dangerous illusion. Nearly half of Horatio Gates's force had never experienced the kind of battle they were about to fight. The British understood exactly how to exploit that weakness. On paper, Gates commanded roughly 3,700 men. The exact number fluctuates between contemporary reports, but historians generally agree that only about 1,500 to 1,900 of them were seasoned Continental regulars. The rest consisted largely of North Carolina and Virginia militia, citizen soldiers who had answered emergency calls after the fall of Charleston. That distinction mattered far more than numbers. A Continental regular lived inside the army. He drilled almost every day. He learned how to maintain formation while men beside him fell. He practiced loading his musket until the motions became automatic. Officers shouted commands that every soldier understood instinctively. Even under artillery fire, trained units could usually preserve enough order to keep fighting. Militia operated under a completely different system. Most served only for short enlistments. Many brought their own firearms from home. Some carried hunting rifles, others old muskets of varying quality. Their officers often came from local communities rather than years of military service. Courage was not the issue. Many militia fought bravely throughout the Revolution. The problem was experience under battlefield conditions. And nothing in 18th century warfare tested inexperienced soldiers more brutally than a bayonet attack. Modern audiences often imagine battles of the American Revolution as endless exchanges of musket fire. In reality, musket volleys frequently decided morale rather than casualties. Smoothbore muskets were notoriously inaccurate beyond moderate range. After exchanging a few volleys, professional armies often sought a quicker conclusion. That conclusion came with steel. British infantry drilled relentlessly to advance, in line without breaking formation. Officers maintained alignment while drums beat the cadence. Muskets remained loaded, but as the distance closed, bayonets transformed every firearm into a 6-foot spear. The purpose was not merely to kill. It was to convince the enemy that remaining in place meant certain death. Military records from the 18th century repeatedly show that many units broke before the attackers even reached them. Few soldiers willingly waited until sharpened steel crashed into their ranks. The British had refined this system over generations of European warfare. The 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers carried battle honors earned during the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. The 33rd Regiment of Foot had fought across Europe before crossing the Atlantic. These were not simply disciplined troops, they were professionals who trusted the man standing on either side of them because they had survived campaigns together. Each regiment functioned almost like a machine. If an officer fell, another immediately stepped forward. If casualties opened gaps, soldiers automatically closed ranks. Commands passed down the line with remarkable speed. Every movement had been rehearsed thousands of times. Across the field stood farmers, laborers, tradesmen, and young volunteers who barely knew the men beside them. Neither side underestimated the other. Lord Charles Cornwallis certainly did not. Unlike some British commanders earlier in the war, Cornwallis had already learned that American regulars could fight extremely well. At Brandywine, Monmouth, and numerous smaller engagements, Continental soldiers had proven capable of standing against Britain's finest infantry. Cornwallis respected disciplined opponents. His objective was not to attack the strongest part of Gates's army. It was to find the weakest. That opportunity emerged because of geography. The battlefield north of Camden offered little room for elaborate maneuver. Thick pine forests restricted visibility, while patches of swamp and scrub limited movement off the main road. Both armies would deploy in relatively narrow formations, facing each other across open ground. There would be no dramatic cavalry sweep around the flanks, no hidden reserve marching over distant hills. The battle would be decided where the lines met. For Gates, this created a difficult puzzle. His strongest troops were the Maryland and Delaware Continentals under Major General Johann de Kalb. These veterans had survived years of hard campaigning and remained among the finest infantry available in the South. Everything else was uncertain. The Virginia militia had only recently joined the Army. The North Carolina militia possessed little confidence after months of British victories across the region. Some officers quietly questioned whether these units could withstand a determined assault. Others believed simple numbers would compensate for inexperience. Gates himself appeared optimistic. He had defeated a British army at Saratoga. He expected aggressive action to compensate for the weaknesses in his command. Instead of delaying Cornwallis while additional troops assembled, he chose to seek a decisive battle. It was exactly what the British wanted. Then, on the night of August 15th, something happened that neither commander had planned. Both armies began marching toward each other in darkness. Neither realized the enemy was doing exactly the same thing. Just after midnight, somewhere along the sandy road north of Camden, advance guards suddenly collided at point-blank range. The battle had almost begun by accident. Just after midnight on August 16, 1780, the silence outside Camden shattered without warning. An American advance guard moving south along the sandy road suddenly stumbled into British light infantry marching north. Neither side expected contact. Muskets flashed almost point-blank through the darkness. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Horses panicked. For several chaotic minutes, neither commander knew whether he had run into a scouting party or the leading edge of the enemy's entire army. The exchange itself accomplished little militarily. Casualties were light, and both sides eventually pulled back to reorganize before dawn. Strategically, however, everything had changed. Until that moment, Gates and Cornwallis had both been advancing blind. Now, each commander knew the enemy stood only a short distance away. There would be no maneuvering around the other's flank, no opportunity to delay. By sunrise, both armies would be committed to a full-scale battle. Cornwallis reacted first. Rather than withdrawing toward Camden and waiting behind stronger defensive positions, he made a decision that reflected his confidence in the quality of his troops. He would attack immediately. His army numbered roughly 2,100 men, significantly smaller than Gates's force. But numbers alone concealed the real balance of power. Nearly every infantry battalion under Cornwallis consisted of experienced regulars who had campaigned for years in America. Their officers trusted them to execute difficult maneuvers under fire, and the soldiers trusted one another in return. Cornwallis believed discipline could outweigh numerical inferiority. History would prove him right. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, officers began arranging the British line. The elite 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers occupied the right. Beside them stood the veteran 33rd Regiment of Foot, one of the formations Cornwallis knew he could rely on in the hardest fighting. Supporting units extended the line while artillery took position where it could command the open ground ahead. Everything followed standard British doctrine. Nothing was improvised. Across the field, Gates was making decisions that historians would debate for centuries. His deployment initially looked logical. The Maryland and Delaware Continentals under Major General Johann de Kalb formed the American right. These veterans represented the strongest infantry in the army. If they held their ground, they could absorb almost anything the British attempted. The militia occupied the opposite wing. On paper, that arrangement appeared balanced. In reality, one detail transformed it into a disaster waiting to happen. The inexperienced Virginia militia found themselves directly opposite Cornwallis's best assault troops, the 23rd and 33rd Regiments. Whether Gates fully appreciated that matchup remains uncertain. Some historians argue he expected the dense woodland to reduce the effectiveness of British attacks. Others suggest he simply followed conventional European practice by placing regulars on the right and militia on the left without considering the specific enemy formations. Whatever his reasoning, the result was unmistakable. Britain's most disciplined bayonet regiments now faced the least experienced soldiers in the American Army. This was exactly the kind of imbalance professional commanders searched for. Cornwallis recognized it almost immediately. Unlike many 18th century battles, Camden offered little room for elaborate tactical innovation. Dense woods limited visibility beyond the immediate front. Swamps protected portions of both flanks, making large turning movements impractical. The road between Camden and Charlotte divided much of the battlefield, forcing both armies into relatively straightforward linear deployments. That simplicity actually magnified every decision. There were few opportunities to compensate for mistakes after the fighting began. If one section of the line collapsed, nearby units had little space to maneuver around it. Everything depended on each wing holding long enough for the rest of the army to do its job. Meanwhile, another problem had been quietly undermining Gates's army for days. His soldiers were exhausted. During the advance toward Camden, Gates had pushed his force aggressively through the Carolina heat despite serious supply shortages. Rations were inconsistent. Many men survived on green corn and whatever food could be gathered along the march. Contemporary accounts describe widespread stomach illnesses caused by poor nutrition and inadequate preparation of food. Some soldiers entered battle already weakened before firing a single shot. The British faced hardships of their own, but their logistical situation remained considerably more stable. Again, the difference was not dramatic by itself. Combined with everything else, it became another advantage. As dawn finally burned away the remaining mist, officers rode behind their formations delivering final instructions. Drums rolled across the fields. Artillery crews lit slow matches. Thousands of muskets were loaded almost simultaneously. Then, Cornwallis made the decision that would determine the entire battle. He did not wait for the Americans to fire first. He ordered his veterans to advance with the bayonet. At that exact moment, two completely different ideas of warfare began moving toward each other. One relied on discipline built over years of relentless training. The other depended on men who had never before been asked to stand their ground against Britain's most feared battlefield weapon. Within minutes, one side would discover that courage alone was not enough. The order rippled down the British line with remarkable calm. Advance. Drummers struck the cadence. Officers lowered their swords. The red ranks stepped forward together. Muskets held level, bayonets glinting in the early morning sun. There was no rush, no shouting, no dramatic charge across open ground. British infantry had been trained to advance at a measured pace because discipline, not speed, won 18th century battles. Across the field, the Virginia militia watched the line emerge from the smoke. For many of them, this was the first time they had ever seen a professional army advancing exactly as it had been drilled to do. Hundreds of red-coated soldiers remained perfectly aligned despite the uneven ground. Gaps closed almost automatically. Officers walked behind the front ranks, correcting intervals as calmly as if they were on a parade ground. Then American artillery opened fire. Round shot tore through the advancing line. A few British soldiers fell. Others immediately stepped into their places. The formation barely slowed. The militia answered with scattered musket volleys. Clouds of white powder smoke rolled across the field, briefly hiding the British advance. When the smoke drifted away, the red line was still coming. Closer, closer. British muskets erupted almost simultaneously. The volley echoed through the pines, cutting gaps into the American line. Men stumbled backward, others instinctively ducked. Before many militia officers could restore order, Cornwallis gave the command his veterans had been waiting for. Bayonets. The British lowered their muskets and accelerated. What happened next lasted only minutes, but it destroyed an army. Unlike Hollywood portrayals, bayonet charges rarely ended in prolonged hand-to-hand fighting. Their power came from psychology. Watching hundreds of disciplined soldiers move directly toward you with fixed steel triggered something far older than military training. Every instinct screamed to move. Professional soldiers had spent years learning to ignore that instinct. Most of Gates's militia had never been taught how. Some fired a final hurried volley. Others tried desperately to reload, their hands shaking as they tore cartridges open with their teeth. Many never completed the process. As the British closed the remaining distance, cracks began appearing in the American line. One company stepped backward. Another shifted sideways. Someone started running. Nobody knows with certainty who fled first. Contemporary accounts differ, and in the confusion of battle, few observers could identify exactly where the collapse began. But once a handful of men broke formation, the effect spread with terrifying speed. Militia standing beside them saw neighbors retreating. They assumed the line had been ordered to withdraw, or worse, that everyone else was already running. Within seconds, what had begun as isolated movement became a wave. Entire companies turned around. Officers shouted for them to stop. Some grabbed soldiers by the coats. Others stood directly in front of the retreating men with drawn swords. It made almost no difference. The line dissolved. Thousands of militia surged toward the rear, throwing away muskets, cartridge boxes, and blankets to run faster. Clouds of dust rose above the road as frightened men collided with one another, desperate only to escape what they believed would become a massacre. The British kept advancing. Many barely needed to use their bayonets at all. The mere threat had accomplished its purpose. Horatio Gates watched the disaster unfold almost immediately. Everything he had planned depended upon the militia holding long enough for the Continental regulars to engage decisively on the opposite wing. Instead, his entire left flank had disappeared before the battle had truly developed. The retreat quickly became impossible to control. Fleeing militia crashed into reserve units. Supply wagons clogged the roads. Mounted officers struggled to move against the human tide pouring away from the battlefield. Gates attempted to rally portions of the army, but the momentum of panic overwhelmed every effort. Eventually, he found himself carried away with the retreat, riding north alongside hundreds of fleeing soldiers. His critics would later claim he abandoned the army. The reality was more complicated. Once an 18th century army dissolved into uncontrolled flight, individual commanders possessed remarkably little ability to reverse it. Without intact formations, orders became meaningless. By mid-morning, Gates was no longer commanding a battle. He was watching an army disintegrate. Yet while the American left collapsed into chaos, something extraordinary was happening on the opposite side of the field. Johann de Kalb's Continental veterans had not moved. They had seen the militia disappear. They knew their flank was now exposed, and instead of retreating, they stepped forward. For the next hour, a few hundred exhausted regulars would fight nearly the entire British Army alone, proving that Camden was never a story about American cowardice. It was a story about what happened when one part of an army was asked to survive a test it had never been prepared to face. While Horatio Gates's left wing dissolved into a cloud of dust and panic, the right side of the American line barely moved. Major General Johann de Kalb understood immediately what had happened. The militia were gone. His own flank was now completely exposed. Every rule of 18th century warfare said he should begin an orderly withdrawal before the British surrounded him. Instead, he ordered his men forward. It was an extraordinary decision, and it transformed what could have been a complete rout into one of the fiercest infantry fights of the entire Revolution. Unlike the militia, the Maryland and Delaware Continentals had spent years learning exactly how to survive under pressure. They had marched through brutal campaigns. They had endured shortages, defeats, and endless drills. Most importantly, they trusted the officers beside them and the soldiers standing in their ranks. Training could not eliminate fear, but it could prevent fear from becoming panic. As British units wheeled toward the exposed American right, de Kalb's Continentals advanced with remarkable discipline. Their first volley struck hard. British soldiers stumbled backward as musket balls tore through the leading companies. Before the smoke cleared, the Americans continued forward, refusing to surrender the initiative. For a few minutes, the battle looked nothing like the collapse occurring elsewhere on the field. Instead of running, the Continentals pushed Britain's regulars back. Several British officers later admitted that the resistance surprised them. They had expected the entire American army to disintegrate after the militia fled. Instead, they found themselves locked in a determined firefight against veterans who refused to yield ground. The fighting quickly became savage. Visibility shrank beneath thick clouds of black powder smoke. Commands could barely be heard over continuous musket fire. Men loaded and fired almost mechanically, biting cartridges open, ramming powder and ball down blackened barrels, bringing muskets to their shoulders again and again until the weapons became too fouled to load easily. Every volley shortened the distance. Eventually, firing alone could no longer decide the contest. The opposing lines collided. Bayonets crossed. Musket stocks became clubs. Officers drew swords and fought alongside their men. This was the kind of battle Britain's veterans expected. It was also the kind of battle de Kalb's regulars had trained to fight. For nearly an hour, they absorbed repeated attacks while launching several counterattacks of their own. Contemporary reports suggest parts of the British line were forced backward more than once as Maryland Continentals pressed forward with fixed bayonets. Cornwallis suddenly faced a problem. His victory on the left had been overwhelming, but the American right refused to collapse. As long as de Kalb's force remained intact, the battle was not completely finished. The British commander responded the way experienced generals often did. He stopped treating the two wings as separate fights. Instead, he concentrated strength against the remaining Continentals. Fresh British units shifted toward the American right, while cavalry maneuvered around the open flank left behind by the fleeing militia. Slowly but relentlessly, the Continentals found themselves attacked from more than one direction. Their discipline had bought valuable time. It could not create soldiers that no longer existed. The shrinking American line continued fighting even as British infantry wrapped around both sides. Companies that had begun the morning shoulder to shoulder were now isolated pockets, each defending itself against growing numbers of attackers. At the center of the struggle rode Johann de Kalb himself. The 60-year-old Bavarian officer had spent most of his life serving in European armies before volunteering for the American cause. Unlike many foreign officers who sought glory or promotion, de Kalb had earned the respect of the soldiers under his command through competence and calm leadership. Throughout the battle, he remained dangerously close to the front. Again and again, witnesses saw him riding into the thickest fighting, rallying companies that were beginning to waver and directing local counterattacks wherever British pressure increased. His presence helped keep the line together far longer than anyone expected. But no amount of leadership could overcome simple arithmetic. The British continued tightening the circle. American casualties mounted. Ammunition ran low. Units that had begun the battle hundreds strong were shrinking rapidly. Then de Kalb's horse was shot beneath him. Thrown to the ground, the general climbed back to his feet instead of seeking safety. Sword in hand, he continued directing the defense among his infantry as British soldiers closed from every direction. Moments later, they reached him. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but nearly all agree that de Kalb suffered multiple bayonet wounds while refusing demands to surrender immediately. By the time American soldiers finally carried him from the field, he had been struck repeatedly and was bleeding heavily from wounds that no 18th century surgeon could truly repair. He would die 3 days later. His last battle had delayed the British long enough to prove an important truth. Camden was never lost because American soldiers lacked courage. The Continental regulars had demonstrated extraordinary determination under impossible conditions. The battle had been decided much earlier, when Britain's finest assault regiments met inexperienced militia exactly where Horatio Gates had placed them. Once that first line broke, even the bravery of de Kalb's veterans could no longer save the army. By late morning, the fighting around Camden was effectively over. What remained was pursuit. Once the Continental line finally broke under overwhelming pressure, Cornwallis refused to let the Americans escape in an organized retreat. He knew that a defeated army could recover if allowed to regroup. A destroyed army could not. That responsibility fell largely to Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Few British officers inspired as much fear among American soldiers as Tarleton. At just 26 years old, he commanded the British Legion, a highly mobile force of cavalry and light infantry built for speed rather than prolonged combat. Throughout the Southern campaign, Tarleton had repeatedly demonstrated his ability to exploit victories before an enemy could recover. Camden presented the perfect opportunity. As the remaining American formations dissolved, Tarleton's cavalry surged onto the roads leading north. Mounted soldiers could move several times faster than exhausted infantry, and the fleeing Americans had already abandoned much of their equipment in panic. What followed was not another organized battle. It was a relentless chase. Small groups of Continental soldiers attempted to form defensive positions along the road, only to be overtaken before larger numbers could gather. Wagons clogged narrow crossings. Broken units mixed together, making it nearly impossible for officers to identify who belonged to which regiment. Every mile scattered the army even further. Many soldiers simply disappeared into the Carolina countryside. Some reached friendly farms. Others hid in forests for days before attempting to rejoin American forces. Thousands never returned to Gates' command. The losses reflected the scale of the disaster. Although exact figures vary among historical sources, the Americans suffered roughly 800 to 900 killed and wounded, while approximately 1,000 more were captured. Combined, well over half of Gates's army was killed, wounded, captured, or permanently dispersed. British casualties were dramatically lower. Cornwallis lost around 300 men killed and wounded. For a battle involving nearly 6,000 soldiers, the imbalance was extraordinary. Even more damaging than the casualties was what the Americans left behind. British troops captured 8 artillery pieces, large quantities of muskets, thousands of cartridges, supply wagons, food, medical stores, even official military papers. An army already struggling with logistics suddenly possessed almost nothing. Horatio Gates escaped the battlefield with a handful of mounted officers, riding north at remarkable speed. Contemporary accounts suggest he covered nearly 60 miles before finally stopping. The distance quickly became part of his reputation. Political opponents mocked him mercilessly, claiming the general had fled faster than any soldier under his command. Although those attacks often ignored the chaos surrounding the collapse, Gates's credibility suffered enormous damage. Only 3 years earlier, he had been celebrated as the victor of Saratoga. Now he was blamed for one of the worst defeats in American military history. Congress soon ordered an investigation into the campaign. While Gates was never formally court-martialed over Camden, his reputation never fully recovered. Before long, George Washington supported replacing him with Major General Nathaniel Greene, an officer whose approach to warfare differed dramatically. Greene drew a harsh lesson from Camden. The British were exceptionally dangerous in conventional set-piece battles where disciplined regulars could exploit their superior training. Trying to defeat them head-on under unfavorable conditions only magnified that advantage. Instead, Greene chose a strategy built on movement, logistics, and attrition. Rather than risking everything in one decisive engagement, he divided his forces, threatened British supply lines, forced Cornwallis to march constantly, and accepted tactical withdrawals whenever necessary if they preserved the army. At first glance, that approach looked less impressive than seeking another Saratoga. In practice, it proved devastating. Every British victory became more expensive. Every mile deeper into the Carolinas stretched supply lines farther. Every occupied town demanded additional troops. Cornwallis continued winning battles, but he struggled to translate those victories into lasting control. Ironically, Camden itself exposed one of Britain's greatest strategic limitations. Cornwallis had destroyed Gates's field army with remarkable efficiency. Yet despite this overwhelming success, Loyalist support across the South did not suddenly stabilize. Patriot militia continued operating throughout the countryside. American recruitment resumed. New Continental units slowly formed under different commanders. The British had won exactly the kind of tactical victory European armies traditionally sought. The war, however, refused to behave like a European war. Destroying one army did not end the rebellion. Instead, it forced the Americans to adapt. The lessons learned at Camden would shape every major Southern campaign that followed. And within little more than a year, those lessons would contribute directly to trapping Cornwallis himself at Yorktown. The road from America's worst battlefield collapse to Britain's final surrender had already begun. When news of the defeat reached Philadelphia, the shock was immediate. Only 3 years earlier, Americans had celebrated Saratoga as proof that Britain's army could be beaten. Camden seemed to erase that confidence in a single morning. An army had collapsed. The South appeared exposed. Cornwallis controlled the battlefield, captured American artillery, and scattered the largest force standing between his army and North Carolina. By every traditional military standard, Britain had achieved exactly what victory was supposed to look like. Yet history remembers Camden for a different reason. It exposed two truths that neither side fully understood before August 1780. The first was brutally simple. Raw courage could never substitute for preparation. The Virginia and North Carolina militia were not cowards. Many of the same communities that fled at Camden continued resisting British occupation for years afterward. Some of those men returned to fight again under different commanders. Others joined partisan leaders such as Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, and Andrew Pickens, becoming highly effective in raids and irregular warfare. Their failure at Camden was not a failure of character. It was a failure of placing inexperienced soldiers into the one type of battle that demanded years of collective training. The second lesson was aimed directly at British commanders. Cornwallis had destroyed Gates's army. He had done almost everything correctly. His intelligence proved accurate. His deployment exploited the American weakness. His veterans executed their attack with remarkable discipline. His cavalry transformed retreat into disaster. Operationally, Camden was one of the finest victories any British commander achieved during the Revolution. And yet, the rebellion survived. Within weeks, new American forces were assembling. Militia activity increased across the Carolinas. British supply lines remained under constant pressure. Every convoy required escorts. Every isolated outpost became vulnerable. Every Loyalist victory demanded additional troops simply to hold territory that had already been conquered once. This was the central contradiction of Britain's southern campaign. Winning battles was not the same as winning the war. Camden demonstrated that Britain could destroy American armies in open battle. It also demonstrated that destroying one army did not destroy the Revolution. George Washington understood that distinction perhaps better than anyone. He had spent years avoiding exactly the kind of decisive confrontation Gates accepted at Camden. Critics often accused Washington of being overly cautious because he frequently withdrew instead of risking his army. Camden became powerful evidence that preserving an army could matter more than winning a single battle. An army could retreat. It could recruit. It could learn. A destroyed army could do none of those things. Nathaniel Greene embraced that philosophy after replacing Gates. Rather than seeking one dramatic victory, he forced Cornwallis into a campaign of constant movement. At Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and countless smaller operations, American forces fought selectively, withdrew when necessary, and steadily increased the cost of every British success. The strategy frustrated Cornwallis. He continued winning tactical engagements. But each victory left his army smaller, farther from reliable supplies, and deeper inside hostile territory. 14 months after Camden, that pattern reached its inevitable conclusion. At Yorktown, Cornwallis found himself trapped by American and French forces with no practical route of escape. The commander who had won one of Britain's greatest battlefield victories was now compelled to surrender an entire field army. Camden had not been erased by Yorktown. It had helped make Yorktown possible. Its lessons shaped the commanders who finished the war. Looking back, the battle remains one of the clearest demonstrations that wars are decided on multiple levels at once. Tactical success, operational planning, logistics, leadership, training, strategy. Cornwallis dominated the tactical battle. Gates lost it through a single catastrophic deployment decision. Kalb proved what disciplined soldiers could accomplish even in defeat. Greene learned how not to fight the British. Washington saw his long-held strategy confirmed. And the revolution endured because the Americans adapted faster than the British could exploit their victories. On the morning of August 16, 1780, Britain's finest soldiers shattered an American army in less than an hour. But the decision that ultimately determined the Revolutionary War was not made on that battlefield. It was made afterward, when American commanders accepted that defeating Britain would require fighting a different kind of war than the one they had just lost. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to see more battles where a single command decision changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments. Which American Revolutionary War battle do you think was decided by one crucial decision more than any other?